Hello, I'm Gwenne McIntosh and I'm a Senior Lecturer at the University of Stirling. I'm here to present the findings of my PhD study, which relates to understanding the experience of male caregivers caring for a partner with Alzheimer's dementia. And this session is just a short session to take you through the study and the key findings, and then a little bit of reflection on my experience as a researcher. Really, the background to this study, it came about because I was first working as a nurse. I worked in sort of slow stream rehab service, it was called back then, and then worked in daycare and started to work with young people with new diagnosis of psychosis. And my main role was in supporting them and their families to come to terms with the diagnosis. And at that point in my career that I started to realise the impact that that experiences around mental health had on families. And I left the NHS to begin work in a voluntary sector organisation working to support and inform families of people with diagnosis schizophrenia. From then I worked in GP practices in a pilot project supporting family carers of people who require care at home for multiple reasons, and I quickly became aware of how prevalent families were caring for people with dementia. And I really became interested in the different types of support that men accessed in relation to their caring role, and noticed a real difference in the types of services and types of support that men sought out and accessed compared to females. So that was a number of years ago, and it stayed with me. So when I had the opportunity to do my PhD, I really wanted to explore this in a little bit more depth. So I really wanted to get an experiential research project. So certainly the nature of the study was always going to be qualitative and phenomenological. I used semi-structured interviews with 7 men who were caring for their partners with Alzheimer's dementia. And I used IPA as the analysis for the interviews, and the research questions are there for you to see. They're very much focused around decision making and how they perceived respite and support services and how they went about accessing that. So the study was guided by Smith et al.'s framework around interpretive phenomenological analysis. It provided a really nice and neat framework for me, who was a kind of novice researcher, to really examine the human lived experience. And it helped me to report on that experience from an individual perspective and really pay attention to that narrative through the different steps. The steps 1 to 4 were completed for each individual transcript, and then you moved on to the next transcript in just that kind of chronological manner, so that you can really spend the time to really focus on that individual narrative. And it's not until the final stage do you kind of step back and look across all the different transcripts and the analysis to start to interpret some of the similarities and differences and how they connect. So the aim is to draw common meaning or the essence of that experience being narrated, and also having a very transparent interpretation that includes that researcher lens, which I found really helpful, particularly because I was quite engaged in the topic and very interested and passionate and had a lot of experience around working with family carers. So it helped me to start to tease out and look at my role in this whole process. So in the undertaking the study, we had 3 key themes were identified through the analysis, and these were lack of influence, changes in losses, and protecting others. And the diagram on this slide takes you just a step back from those 3 themes. It's when the preliminary themes from the individual analysis were coming through. And I was very much aware that there was connections with loss, there was impact and influence on the relationships, changes in the relationships, changes in responsibility, perceptions of relationships, the support and services, very much captured around how people valued certain types of support or didn't value types of support, the timing of support, whether or not support and services met the needs of the individual requiring care or the needs of the carer, and how reliable that the service was or the support network was, and whether or not the person had confidence in it. The decision-making aspect of the study had multiple aspects that came through in the narratives, but certainly centred around fairly negative experiences around decision-making, lack of power, limited control, or ineffective decisions, and often decisions that were driven by others or driven by the changes that people experienced. The losses that men spoke about included a number of different aspects, for example, role, identity, sense of freedoms, spontaneity, opportunities to be involved in different aspects of their life in the way that they had done before. And these preliminary themes were then pulled together and synthesised into these three overarching themes. Lack of influence reflected making decisions and the impact and influence of the decisions that are made, both positive and negative. The changes and losses really captured the scope of change and loss that caregivers experienced, and also how that impacted on the person that they cared for and others around them. Protecting others included their perceived role and duty to protect others. It was related to sense of being male in the family, being often a father, a husband, and it also included the adaptation and adjustment and the coping strategies that the men developed along the way to allow them to adjust to the changes and losses, adapt to new situations and new experiences, and to problem solve and be creative in the way that they solved issues that they presented. So capturing the essence of these themes, so some of the quotes here are quite brief quotes just for the purposes of the slides. Lack of influence was very much around feeling that decisions were made by other people. I'm not the one that made that decision, so that came across quite frequently in the transcriptions, and it was very much around other people making decisions or dementia itself making the decisions. So the nature of dementia and the way it impacted on the person they cared for was the driver for that decision. One thing was a consequence of another. Decisions like that, this was about respite, are almost inevitable. It's like being on a treadmill. So the men found that there was a lack of impact and influence on the decisions that they made relating to caring, and even when they were proactive in the decisions that they made, it often left them feeling powerless, either because other people or other things were taking over the decision making. And this lack of inclusion and lack of involvement and lack of power in decision making was very damaging in relation to their sense of identity and their sense of role. The changes and losses in the second theme were vast and not fully represented here in this slide, but they included the loss of role, the loss of work, the loss of connections, and these then triggered a loss of identity and self-esteem, and these quite frequently made the men feel more isolated, and also intensified caring because it was done almost in a bit of a bubble. And you can see from the quotes here, one relating to work. I always thought I would work a wee bit longer than 65, but I couldn't. So that caregiving role, that stopped 3 out of the 7 men from working. So they took earlier than anticipated retirement in order to provide care for their partner. Then people feeling that the changes and the role that they had for caring for that individual really kind of trapped them in the house. So I was got in a position where I really couldn't leave the house, and that was quite common for the men, where they felt either physically they couldn't get out because of just the managing and supporting that individual to leave the house, or just not being able to encourage the person to leave the house, and that they didn't want to leave the house. But I think more so it was also about the losses of the individual. So watching this person, I love, gradually being stripped of identity and personality and dignity, and you're party to it. And that real sense of guilt and responsibility when you see the changes and losses impacting on the individual really was quite strong within the data. Protecting others was a really interesting theme that came across, and it related to a number of different aspects of protecting other people, and that those others included those around them, their children, their partner themselves, but interestingly also about protecting people, service providers. So for example, one man stopped care at home services because he felt his wife was too aggressive and too argumentative and not accepting of the care, and he felt guilty, and he felt that it was almost a bit of other people feeling a bit exposed. So it was an interesting dynamic, that feeling the need to protect care providers, rather than thinking about actually supporting their own needs. And this sense of being very independent and feeling that it's their role to provide this care for their partner as part of being married, as part of being in that reciprocal relationship, and remaining independent, protecting others from the impact of dementia and caring, really gave the men a sense of purpose, meaning, and it re-established some sense of control. But the flip side of that was that some of the men then stopped using services and then reduced that interaction, reduced connections with others, so then further influenced the experience of loss and disconnection with others. And this diagram on this slide just highlights some of the connections between these three themes, and some of the kind of inner cycles that encourage further isolation and further distress for family caregivers. So two key things came out in relation to practice. One is avoiding the spiral of disengagement, where people's feelings, or the men's feelings of losses and the lack of influence and impact on their decision making led to more isolation, and more isolation led to more losses. So therefore it impacted again on these decision makings, and really what kept that spiral of disengagement going was unhelpful interactions. So where services weren't reliable, weren't encouraging, weren't inclusive and include the men in the decisions that were being made, then they felt that they would distance themselves from those services and disengage from them. So flipping this over into a spiral of engagement, it's really for me, quite straightforward. It's about changing those relationships and changing those interactions, having services that are reliable, having services where people are aware of the consequences of implementing new things or suggesting new avenues of support, and creating helpful interactions that encourage involvement in decisions rather than taking over and overstepping the decision-making processes and taking that away from the men. Finally, some personal reflections. Transitioning from a practitioner to a researcher is a really tricky path, and I had never anticipated it being as tricky as it was. I felt that there was a real sense of shared values and ethics when I think about mental health nursing and think about research and the ethical considerations around research, and I think that's helpful in some ways. However, where there's more disconnect for me was around that sense of responsibility, duty of care and role. I had anticipated going in to do individual interviews with these men to be quite straightforward, because I would draw from my mental health nursing skills and my ability to communicate and my ability to actively listen and connect with individuals. But actually I found it extremely challenging, emotionally challenging, and that was all relating to who does this benefit. At the time when I was immersed in the interview, I felt that the only person benefiting was me. I was speaking to these men and hearing their stories and hearing their experiences and the high emotional impact that caregiving has had, and this was all for my benefit, and that felt very uncomfortable for me. The way that I dealt with that is through reflection and through reflexivity, working with my supervisors and really looking at uncovering the blind spots, because these aspects didn't occur to me, and it wasn't until I was in the throes of these interviews where I felt really quite strong emotions when listening to the men tell me their stories and feeling like I was given nothing back. I think for me there needs to be more opportunities for novice researchers to really unpick that and really explore that transition from practitioner to researcher in a meaningful way and a supportive way to help new researchers really understand the emotional impact of working so closely with individuals exploring personal experiences. Hope that summarised some of the content of my study, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to the findings. Thank you.